The phone rang in the middle of the afternoon, and the moment I heard the man's voice, I knew it wasn't going to be a friendly chat. His tone was clipped, the kind people use when they've already decided you're guilty. "There's been a complaint," he said. "Apparently you've extended your fence into your neighbor's garden. They had 13 square meters. Now 7 of those are gone." 7. The way he measured it, like a precise theft, made my chest tighten. I gripped the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," I said, more defensive than I meant. "I've got 12 kids. They've got none. I've got no space. They've got plenty. I only took half." Silence on the other end, the kind that feels like judgment. "You can't take what isn't yours," he said finally. "That land belongs to them. You can't just decide otherwise." Heat rose in my face. That land was promised to me years ago. The owner said it would be fine. I'm not taking any more. It's done. But even as I said it, my stomach knotted. His calm, steady voice carried weight. Mine didn't. And for the first time, I felt the sting of doubt. The children were yelling in the background, their noise spilling through the rooms like proof of my desperation. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, insisting, almost pleading. "I have to think of my kids. We need the space." Still, the silence told me I'd already crossed a line. Our house was never meant for 12 children. It creaks under the weight of us. Beds shoved into corners, shoes piled in doorways, arguments bouncing off thin walls. Privacy doesn't exist here. You hear every cough, every secret, every cry through plasterboard and pipes. When we first moved in, the old owner stood with me in the back garden, cigarette hanging from his lips, and said something I held onto like scripture. "Take what you need. No one cares about a few feet at the back." He waved a hand at the hedge, casual, like it was a boundary made of smoke. "Council's not watching. Neighbor doesn't use it." Those words became the promise I carried every time I looked at our cramped yard. Every time I watched the kids kicking a ball against the wall, falling over one another in a patch of grass too small even for a picnic blanket, I thought of his voice. "Take what you need." So, when the time came, I convinced myself it wasn't theft. It was fairness. The neighbors had their roses, their quiet. They had space they didn't fill. We had noise, bodies, and no room to breathe. What's 7 square meters to them when it means my children don't have to play on concrete? That's how desperation talks to you. It whispers that survival is reason enough. It tells you the scales are tilted and you're just balancing them. I didn't see myself as a thief. I saw myself as a mother doing what had to be done. And once you frame it that way, it's easy to ignore the little voice reminding you, land doesn't work on promises. When I finally decided, I didn't call a big company. I couldn't afford that. I found a builder who worked for cash, no questions asked, the kind of man who nodded more than he spoke and promised he'd get it done quick. That was what I needed. Quick. They came with a van full of reclaimed posts and panels. The work was quiet, done mostly in the evenings when the street was distracted with dinners and telly. In a matter of days, the line of our garden crept forward. Straight, neat, new. From where I stood, it looked right. Tidy, purposeful, affixed to a problem no one else wanted to solve. But from the other side, I knew it must have looked different. Greedy. A fence standing where it never used to, stealing sunlight and space. I caught glimpses of the neighbors at their windows, arms folded, phones in hand. Their eyes lingered longer than casual curiosity. Still, I told myself it was fine. The kids were already running along the new line, measuring it with their laughter. I told myself the neighbors would understand once they saw why we needed it. But neighbors rarely see need. They see loss, and what I saw as survival, they saw as theft. It was only a matter of time before someone made it official. The letter came through the slot like a blade. White envelope, council crest, words printed in that clipped, bureaucratic tone that makes everything sound final. Boundary encroachment, action required. I sat at the table reading it twice, 3 times, hoping the words might change. They didn't. Someone had filed an official complaint. Not a whisper anymore, not gossip. It was real. That afternoon, the neighbor appeared at the fence. Mrs. Daly, though I never called her that out loud, only her next door, stood with her arms folded tight across her chest. Behind her, her daughter raised her phone like a weapon, already filming. "You've taken our son," the daughter shouted. "That's our garden. You've stolen half of it." I stood on my side, pulse hammering, pride burning through my shame. "We needed the space," I snapped. "You've got no kids, we've got 12. It's not like you even use it." Their faces hardened. To them, it wasn't about kids or need. It was about lines, about ownership, about what the council had written in black and white. Mrs. Daly jabbed a finger at the new posts. "That fence is theft. It's going to come down, one way or another." I wanted to shout that the land was promised to me, that years ago the old owner had waved his cigarette and said, "Take what you need," that I wasn't stealing, I was surviving. But the words felt hollow in my mouth. A promise spoken in a back garden years ago was never written on paper, and without paper, I had nothing. Still, I lifted my chin. "We're not moving it back," I said, even as doubt gnawed at me. After the shouting at the fence, I couldn't sit still. The letter from the council lay on the counter like a live wire, buzzing every time I walked past. Pride told me I had a defense. Shame told me I didn't. I needed proof. Something on paper to silence the neighbor, to silence the man's clipped voice on the phone, to silence even my own doubts. So I went digging. I pulled up the land registry documents, my hands shaking as I typed. The map loaded slowly, a crude outline of boxes and boundaries, black lines on faded white. My garden, their garden, lines so sharp they might as well have been drawn with a knife. But what I was looking for, the extra strip, the promised bit, the part the old owner had waved his hand at, it wasn't there. Instead, at the bottom, in a note barely longer than a sentence, I found it. Informal boundary agreement between parties, not recorded. Those words hit harder than the neighbors shouting. Not recorded meant not legal, not binding, not worth the air it was spoken with. The promise I had clung to wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't stamped, signed, or filed. It had been nothing more than smoke from a cigarette, words tossed out by a man who wanted to sell his house quickly and cheaply. And I had built my conviction, my fence on it. I stared at the map until the lines blurred. In my head, I kept hearing myself tell the neighbor, "It was promised to me. It was mine to take." And now I knew it never had been. But here's the truth. When you've got 12 kids running wild in a house that's too small, paper doesn't feel like the law. Hunger feels like the law. Noise feels like the law. The crush of bodies and the ache in your chest telling you there isn't enough. That feels like the law. So, even though the registry said otherwise, part of me still clung to my story. Still told myself I had a right. Because letting go of that story meant admitting I hadn't just bent the rules. I'd broken them. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet. It would have been easier if it had just been about a fence. Me against the neighbor. A few feet of grass and sunlight. But trouble has a way of widening. A week later, a flyer slipped through the letterbox. Glossy, smug. Opportunity, land assembly for residential development. The words felt cold in my hands. Someone was buying up gardens on our street, stitching them together into neat parcels for blocks of flats and HMOs. That same afternoon, I overheard two women talking outside the shop. One of them mentioned the neighbor's son-in-law had already sold part of their garden. A tidy sum, apparently. Enough to make them feel righteous about calling the council on me while pocketing money themselves. It hit me like a slap. The shouting, the complaint, the sudden urgency. It wasn't just about principle. My fence was in the way of someone else's deal. The neighbor wasn't just angry about stolen sunlight. She was playing a role in something bigger, something financial. And I was the perfect villain for them to point at. The mother of 12, desperate and reckless, easy to frame as the thief while they signed papers in private. Suddenly, the language in the council letter, the clipped tone on the phone, the cold stares from across the hedge, they all made sense. This wasn't a simple boundary squabble. It was leverage, a way to push me back, to clear the way for profit. I thought I was fighting for survival, but I'd stepped into a game I didn't even know I was playing. And in that game, people like me don't win. The betrayal came from the last place I expected, from the man who'd built the fence in the first place. One evening he dropped by, saying he wanted to check the posts. His voice was casual, but he didn't meet my eyes. I made tea because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. And we sat at the kitchen table. The fence was already a wound between us and the neighbors, the council breathing down our necks, and I could tell he had something heavy in his mouth. He fiddled with his mug, finally clearing his throat. "Listen," he said, "there's something you should know. About the job." I folded my arms, bracing. I didn't just work for you, he admitted. There was someone else involved. They asked me to shift the line, said they'd sort the paperwork later, make it all legal once the dust settled. I thought it'd be fine. My skin went cold. What do you mean, someone else? He rubbed his forehead, ashamed. Developers. They've been buying around here. They slipped me some cash on top of what you paid, told me to move it a few feet their way, said it'd help line things up when the other garden sold. I stared at him, the sound of my children screaming and laughing in the next room pressing against the silence. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. So my family, my home, we were just pawns in someone else's plan? He nodded, miserable. I thought I was doing you a favor too. More space for your lot. Win-win. But he broke off, his shame doing what words couldn't. The truth settled like ash. I'd bled our savings dry to pay him. I'd defended myself against neighbors and counsel, all the while thinking I'd made the decision. But it hadn't been my choice at all. We'd been manipulated, pushed into a fight designed to stir things up, soften boundaries, and force movement for people with bigger wallets. I gripped the edge of the table until my fingers hurt. Do you know what it feels like to stand there, shouting across a fence, defending yourself like a criminal, while my children are packed in a house too small? Do you know what it feels like to believe you're fighting for survival, and then realize you were just being used? His eyes watered. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would blow up like this, but apologies don't undo betrayal. He'd taken my desperation and sold it to the highest bidder. When he left, the mug sat half empty on the table. I stared at it until the tea went cold. For the first time since this whole mess began, I didn't feel like a fighter. I felt like a fool. The fence wasn't mine. The promise wasn't real. And now I knew the worst of it. The line hadn't just been moved in wood and nails. It had been moved in trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't go back where you put it. The fence came down as quickly as it had gone up. The same builder who'd betrayed us returned with his van, this time working for free, shame written all over his face. He didn't talk much, just pulled out posts, lifted panels, and set them back to where the old boundary had been. Each hammer strike sounded like a confession. I stood in the kitchen window, arms folded, watching. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like defeat. By the end of the week, the council sent a letter saying the matter was closed. No fines, no further action, as long as things stayed where they should. But the victory felt hollow. We'd lost money, weeks of sleep, and more pride than I cared to admit. Facing the neighbor again was the hardest part. Mrs. Daly didn't smile, but she didn't spit fire either. She stood at the hedge, arms folded, and muttered, "Glad it's sorted." Her daughter stopped filming. In time, the glares softened into curt nods and eventually into small, awkward exchanges about bins and weather. Not friendship, but not war anymore either. Inside, though, something shifted in me. I'd told myself the fence was about survival, that I was doing what I had to for my kids. And maybe that was true, but survival doesn't excuse lies. Not to others, not to myself. I'd dressed up desperation as fairness, called theft necessity, clung to promises that were never written down. The realization stung, not just because I'd been caught, but because I'd seen myself clearly for the first time. I hadn't been clever. I hadn't outsmarted anyone. I'd let my family be used, let myself be manipulated, and told stories to cover the cracks. Now, when I look at that fence, straight and ordinary where it should be, I see more than wood and nails. I see the price of pretending. I see the cost of trusting words without paper, of turning hope into justification. We thought the fence would buy us space. Instead, it bought us shame. And the truth is simple. The fence wasn't the only thing we couldn't afford. We couldn't afford lies.